Hey guys, Jason here with a DM rankings video. Yes, it's been a good while since we've done one of these. In this video, I will be ranking every TCG promo only card. Now, just to be clear, I'm not ranking every TCG promo card, just cards released in the TCG that were only released as promos and not part of the main expansions. This means cards like Aquahulkus, which was a tournament and McDonald's promo, will not come up because they were released in the main sets. Before I get any further, I also need to give a shout out to AleksVin from the German Duel Masters community, who reached out to me, gave me the idea for the topic, and was nice enough to compile a list of cards to rank. The main metric I will use in this ranking is reasons to play the card. This is a loosely defined metric, and it attempts to consider things like cost, power, effect, and alternatives. If there are any reasons to play it, it's good, and if not, well, we have bottom tier. Starting from the bottom, I'm sorry to say Uber Dragon Zashak is the worst of the worst. He's overcosted at 9 and shamefully only breaks 1 shield on his own. The crew breaker effect isn't very strong on him either when you consider summoning enough dragons to take advantage of it isn't the easiest thing in the world. In my opinion, he's inferior to the already not so great Uber Dragon Jabaha, and both pale in comparison to our beloved Uber Dragon Bajula. Joining Zashak in bottom tier is Giga Grax. At first glance, I didn't think he was completely terrible, but then I thought about it some more. Given how much he costs, he doesn't do very much. You pay 8 mana for a 5k beatstick, who only single breaks mind you, and then you get a Terra Pit effect when he's destroyed. It's just, when you're paying 8 mana for something, you want some sort of game-swinging effect, and a non-immediate Terra Pit just doesn't cut it. I'm not even going to compare this to Lost Soul, Miraculous Plague, etc. Stalab the Life Squasher, who I'm already not that keen on in the TCG, outperforms this card in every conceivable way. The third card we're covering is Angry Maple. Funnily enough, the first card on this list with an acceptable cost. Unfortunately, that's the only thing acceptable about it. With the Power Attacker ability, it effectively swings with 5k power. Unfortunately, its 1k power really holds it back, as it is killed by every weenie, fire spell, and light blocker in the game. Even if we decide to not compare this to the usual suspects, Bronze Arm Tribe, Poisonous Mushroom, etc., cards like Mighty Shouter, Shaman Broccoli, and Radioactive Horn are comparable cards that just do way more. Our next card is, in my experience, one of the most common fast food promos, Twisterfish. A level 5 3k shield trigger vanilla creature is nothing special, but at least it's not particularly offensive since it can hit the field for free. I feel like this card could be borderline playable if some insane Jellyfish support existed, but alas, such is not the case. Aquajolter, being Liquid People, makes a stronger case for inclusion in any deck than Twisterfish, and don't get me started on Aquasurfer. Ultimately, Twisterfish is an inconsequential and forgettable card, but in saying that, even though it doesn't do very much, it at least doesn't offend me like every card we've talked about thus far. Moving on, we have Cutronic Omnistrain, funnily enough, not the only survivor in this ranking. It's a very interesting card, not just because of its bizarre artwork, but also because it's one of the few, if not the only, shield trigger evolutions in the TCG. That in itself is a very interesting mechanic, and one I wish could have been explored further. The survivor effect gives all of your other creatures survivor, and I think this is a pretty interesting ability and is thematically very cool. Unfortunately, it fails because Omnistrain is just too weak, and in a survivor deck, you typically want to keep your engine pieces on the field. This means that the evolution candidates are Blazosaur and Smashhorn, and to be honest, I think I'd rather have those. In this entry, we enter territory where power mana ratios are still bad, but not Giga Grax levels of bad. Amnis Holy Elemental has an embarrassing cost of 7, given it only breaks 1 shield, and has no big effects, but at least it's harder to deal with than everything so far, and is somewhat strong enough to kill stuff. Sadly, as far as clumsy light creatures go, it is outshunned by a lot of things: Earth, Guile, Rebuild, etc. The saving grace should be its effects, which allow it to survive all attacks from darkness creatures and block them, but it's pretty useless when you think about it because most commonly played darkness creatures won't be able to get over it anyway. Since we just covered Amnis, it should come as no surprise that the next card is Gilliam the Tormentor. Everything I said about Amnis applies to Gilliam, but instead of facing stiff competition from big light creatures, he's outclassed by his fellow demon commands. Things like Trox, Gajirabute, Daedalus, etc. are doing much more than Gilliam. The only reason I put Gilliam above Amnis is because there's more of a chance for his effect to trigger. This is due to the fact that high-powered light creatures are more likely to see play than high-powered dark creatures. Now that we've finished scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel, we can talk about some of the cards near the bottom. Brigade Shell Q, our second and final survivor in this ranking, is in my view not a very good card. However, it is saved from bottom tier because it is cheap and somewhat able to generate card advantage. I suppose you could argue that building your survivor deck in such a way can result in more hits with Brigade Shell, but really, you're better off stacking the deck with Mana Ramp and building around Factory Shell Q. This next card, as its name would suggest, is truly nightmarish, but not in a good way. Olgate Nightmare Samurai is a wholly inoffensive but very forgettable card. A slightly unfavorable power-mana ratio, his effect lets you untap him whenever another one of your creatures is destroyed. There might be some cool shenanigans you can pull off with this, but it would require a lot of setup and probably isn't worth it. As I echoed earlier, there are much better demon commands out there, and even better ways to spend 7 mana. At first glance, Lotharix the Iridescent seems like a pretty good card. It's got a great Racing Guardian, 6 mana 4k power, not a terrible power mana ratio, and a useful come into play effect. But then you realize it's an evolution. This card was almost good. Guardians have a lot of cheap evo bait, so it may not seem like a big deal, but this does negatively impact consistency, and that prevents Lotharix from carving a niche for itself. Guardians tend to favor aggressive strategies, and its most successful evolutions demonstrate this. Larbagear and Glenavelle have useful effects and very respectable power mana ratios. In this regard, Lotharix does not lend itself to what your typical Guardian evolution wants to do. On the flip side, it doesn't make a lot of sense to slot Lotharix into a more defensive deck either, since it will always be less consistent than other shield-generating cards like Estel, Sundrop Armor, and Mana Nexus. When I was talking about Amnis and Gilliam, I mentioned how they were worse than other big, clumsy creatures. Big and clumsy creatures like Starcry Dragon, who sports a 7 mana cost, 8k power, and double breaker with no drawback effect. It doesn't have any immediate or board-altering effects though, which limits the card severely. If I'm paying 7 mana, I want the card to do more than just look pretty. In saying that, glass half full people might say it can at least take advantage of dragon support like Kokolupia and Totopepichi, but with a sizable list of playable and semi-playable dragons, there's really no reason to choose Starcry Dragon. For these next 2 entries, I actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about whether they should be in their own tier, but I also figured it doesn't really matter since neither are likely to see much play anyway. With that out of the way, let's talk about Armored Grovelav. While I wouldn't consider it a particularly good card, it at the very least has some use. The power mana ratio for an evolution is a little disappointing, still better than Lotharix though, and it can immediately swing for 2 shields. If one were making a human deck, Armored Grovelav could come in handy as backup copies for Armored Blaster Valdios, but in saying that, humans aren't a great race in the TCG, so the playability of this card is inherently limited. Our last entry for this tier, as you have probably guessed, is Dino Mantis the Might Spinner. It is very comparable to Armored Grovelav in terms of cost, power, and the race's utility, so the general sentiment towards Grovelav is also echoed here. However, I'd say Dino Mantis is better than Grovelav as a whole. Giant insects, while not having as many 2-drops as humans, still have enough low-cost creatures to support evolutions. I also think having higher base power is more important than having Power Attacker, and while prepping the board can be tricky, Dino Mantis' effect can be useful, especially when paired with some of the Scarabs. In this regard, it isn't just playing second fiddle to Ultramantis like Grovelav is to Valdios. Not the most optimal card, it is at least better than everything we've talked about so far. We've finally made it to the top 3 and territory where I don't have to convince myself these cards can be playable. The first one we'll look at is one of the coolest and rarest cards in the world, Neve the Leveler. In a nutshell, it's kind of like a supercharged Rumbling Terrahorn. Obviously, when playing this card, you want to be plussing off it, so the way I see it, you're paying 6 mana to get a +1 or 2 and a mini-boss on the board, which isn't a bad thing. 7 mana is also a very crucial point in the game, so the ability to curve into the creature you searched for is very convenient. While its overall consistency can be speculated on, the fact that it has acceptable stats and can provide card advantage convinces me it's far more playable than everything we've talked about thus far. Our runner-up slot goes to Super Dragon Machine Dolzark. On the whole, its stats are fine, it's a dragon so it has support, and it has a pretty cool effect. In all honesty, this was not a card I was sold on when I first read its effect, but after we tested I realized it could be very powerful. Sure, it's not ideal to give your opponent mana, but depending on the matchup or situation, that may not matter. We found that against aggressive decks, it was a really good tool for controlling the board as it removed 2 creatures for the price of 1 attack, and against defensive decks, it actively threatens blockers, which puts pressure on the opponent. Unlike in DMP, Dulzark doesn't activate when he himself attacks, but at the very least, his effect can trigger when you summon him, i.e., you summon him and then attack with a dragon that's already out. A unique effect and acceptable stats make him one of the more playable dragons, meaning he carves a nice niche for himself. In the playable tier, our 3rd placer had Creature Search, and our 2nd placer was a dragon, so it is only fitting for our 1st placer to be a dragon with Creature Search. Velarika Dragon is a strong card because it's a boss monster that effectively replaces itself when summoned, meaning you force your opponent to deal with multiple threats. Perhaps even more threatening, he can search out the classic finishers like Bazagazil and Balmedius. Really, my only gripe with this card is that it can only search for armored dragons rather than any dragon. T-Dad. Nevertheless, Velarika is a proven concept in Rub Control, is a cornerstone of dragon-based decks, and has potential in mid-range decks. It is these factors that make it a distant first place in our ranking of every TCG promo-only card. So that's our list. Did I miss any? Tell me in the comments below. Also feel free to let me know how you would rank all the TCG promo-only cards. As usual, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.